5 hours later, when the champagne flutes were still half full and the string quartet was packing up, the bride's uncle would be shouting into his phone in the lobby, demanding lawyers, demanding explanations, demanding someone explain how an engagement party had turned into a financial emergency. I would already be gone by then. That part matters, but not yet. To understand how it happened, you have to start with the moment I stepped through the revolving doors and felt every eye in the room decide who I was supposed to be. My name is Maribel Quince. I walked into the engagement party wearing a simple navy dress I'd owned for years. No sequins, no label stitched somewhere obvious. My hair was pulled back, my makeup understated, my shoes sensible. In a room that glittered with diamonds and aggressive wealth, I looked like a footnote. That was intentional. The lobby ceiling arched high above us, all marble and gold accents, a space designed to make people feel smaller than the money that moved through it. The bride's family had chosen this hotel because it announced status without needing words. They wanted everyone to know they had arrived. The snickering started before I reached the check-in desk. I heard it over the music, a sharp little laugh followed by a whisper that wasn't meant to be quiet enough. "Look at what he grew up with." The bride didn't even bother lowering her voice. She was standing with her mother and aunt, all three dressed in coordinated pastels, arms linked like a united front. They looked me over the way people inspect furniture they didn't order. My fiancé, Daniel, stood beside them. He heard it. I know he did, because his jaw tightened for half a second. Then he looked away. That was how this night was going to go. I'd met Daniel when he was still borrowing money for gas and pretending it didn't bother him. I helped him rewrite resumes, coached him through interviews, paid rent when his paycheck didn't stretch far enough. I was there before the promotions, before the tailored suits, before his parents suddenly spoke about him with pride instead of concern. When his world got bigger, mine got quieter. Tonight was proof of that. As I crossed the room, conversations paused just long enough for curiosity to curdle into judgment. The bride's mother gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked where I was from, the way people ask when they've already decided the answer will amuse them. When I told her, she nodded slowly, like she'd just confirmed a theory. "Oh," she said, "that explains it. Explains the dress, explains the posture, explains why I didn't belong under these chandeliers." I took my assigned seat at the edge of the room, far from the head table, close enough to see everything, far enough to be forgotten. Waiters passed me without offering refills. A cousin asked if I was with the catering staff. Someone else asked if I was enjoying the hotel for the first time. Each comment stacked neatly on top of the last, a growing tower of small humiliations that nobody thought worth defending me from. Daniel stopped by once, long enough to murmur that we'd talk later. His eyes slid away before I could answer. He was already practicing absence. I watched the bride's family toast themselves, brag about connections, talk loudly about deals they assumed impressed everyone within earshot. They spoke about the hotel like it was a borrowed stage, a glamorous backdrop they'd rented for the evening, something temporary that existed solely for their celebration. They never once asked who I was or why I was there. They'd already decided. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, letting them believe the story they were telling themselves, letting them enjoy it, because this building wasn't neutral ground, and by the time they realized that, the damage would already be done. By the time dinner was served, the whispers had lost any pretense of subtlety. What started as glances and murmurs hardened into commentary delivered at full volume, the kind people use when they've decided you don't matter enough to be hurt. The bride's mother leaned across the table and asked Daniel, not me, if I was a friend from his old neighborhood. When he hesitated, she smiled tightly and said, "It's just unusual to see such modest choices at an event like this." The bride laughed and lifted her glass. "Some people don't understand that there's a standard," she said, eyes flicking to my dress, "but it's good to know your place." She said it lightly, like a joke everyone was supposed to enjoy. Several people did. Daniel didn't laugh. He also didn't stop her. I was moved to the far end of the table under the excuse of seating adjustments, slid between a distant cousin and an empty chair meant for someone who hadn't shown. No one apologized. The bride's sister took the seat that had been meant for me near the center, her designer bag draped over the back like a flag marking territory. It was done smoothly, efficiently, the way people take things when they're certain there will be no consequences. I sat there and watched. I watched waitstaff glance toward the head table before responding to requests, even though those people weren't actually in charge. I watched a hotel manager hover nearby, nodding politely to the bride's father as he bragged about bringing so much business here tonight, as if one engagement party made him a benefactor. I watched contracts being passed around upstairs through the open mezzanine doors, sleek folders handed from hand to hand, signatures celebrated with applause and raised glasses. Everyone assumed they knew what those papers meant. They didn't. Years of being underestimated teach you how to be still. They teach you how to listen without reacting, how to catalog moments instead of confronting them. I'd learned early that anger only entertains people like this. Silence makes them careless. So I smiled when spoken to and said very little. I let them believe I was embarrassed. I let them believe I was overwhelmed by the room, the money, the confidence radiating off people who'd never had to earn restraint. The bride's mother finally turned to me directly. "And you are?" she asked, as if my name had slipped her mind despite being announced earlier. "Maribel," I said. She nodded once, dismissively. "Well, Maribel, I hope you're enjoying the hotel. It's quite an experience for some people." Her tone made it clear she didn't include herself in that category. I told her it was lovely, that I'd always appreciated good bones in a building. She didn't understand what I meant, and that was fine. As dessert arrived, the family grew louder, emboldened by wine and the comfort of believing they were the most important people in the room. They spoke openly about future renovations, about how often they'd host events here, once Daniel married into the family. The bride's uncle joked about getting a friends and family rate for life. Everyone laughed again. Daniel avoided my eyes. He was seated where I should have been, smiling when prompted, nodding when spoken to, already adjusting himself to a version of his life where I was peripheral. I noticed then what I'd been waiting for. Near the service corridor, just past the mirrored column, a senior staff member stood watching the room, not the guests. Her attention flicked toward the mezzanine, then back to the floor, then briefly to me. It was quick, professional, almost imperceptible, but it told me exactly what I needed to know. The timing was off upstairs. The signatures were happening too fast. The approvals hadn't been routed properly. This wasn't going to unfold the way they thought. I took a slow sip of water and folded my napkin neatly in my lap, feeling the familiar calm settle in. Let them take my seat. Let them believe they'd rearranged me out of relevance. They were standing on a stage they didn't own, celebrating a future they hadn't secured, in a building that was already preparing to remind them of that fact. I decided early that night that I would not correct a single assumption. Every sideways glance, every softened insult, every smile that came a second too late was an invitation to step into the version of me they'd already written. Small, embarrassed, grateful to be included at all. I accepted the role without protest because I knew exactly how dangerous it made them feel. The bride grew louder as the evening went on, emboldened by the way no one challenged her. She joked about upgrading Daniel's life now that he was marrying into a family that understood quality. She made a point of thanking her parents for teaching her the difference between value and price. Each remark landed where it was meant to. People laughed. People nodded. People looked at me and then away, satisfied with the hierarchy they believed had been established. I kept my eyes down and my posture folded inward, the way I'd learned to do years ago when speaking up only made things worse. I nodded when spoken to, answered politely when cornered, and apologized once when I hadn't actually done anything wrong. The apology felt like blood in the water. The bride's cousin asked if I was nervous being around so much money. Her aunt asked if I'd ever stayed somewhere this nice before. I let the color rise in my cheeks and looked embarrassed, because embarrassment reads as confirmation to people like this. Daniel stayed quiet through all of it. He smiled when he was supposed to, clinked glasses when prompted, and avoided every opportunity to intervene. His silence wasn't passive, it was a choice. Each moment he failed to speak became a small signature on a contract he didn't realize he was signing. Watching him let it happen hurt in a way I hadn't prepared for. Not sharp, not sudden, but dull and constant, like pressure building behind the eyes. They treated the hotel like a toy they'd been handed for the night. The bride's father spoke loudly about expanding the event space, about how he'd improve the flow of the rooms, about how ownership should listen to people like him if they wanted to stay relevant. He gestured broadly, careless with his words, assuming no one present had any authority beyond pouring drinks and clearing plates. People like him mistake access for control. They confuse being welcomed with being important. I listened and calculated. I had waited years for this convergence without knowing exactly what it would look like. Not this family, not this bride, not even this hotel, but the alignment of witnesses, paperwork, and entitlement. I knew how contracts move through spaces like this. I knew how approvals were supposed to be layered, how nothing significant happened in a vacuum, how arrogance always rushed what caution would slow. Tonight was too loud, too public, too confident to end quietly. The bride leaned toward me at one point, her smile sharp. "You're very quiet," she said, "but I suppose that's for the best." I smiled back, smaller than hers. "I wouldn't want to make a scene." She laughed, pleased. Exactly. That was when I knew she believed her own story completely. They all did. They believed the hotel was a backdrop, that the people serving them were invisible, that the night belonged to them simply because they'd dressed for it. They believed Daniel had risen on his own, that I was an artifact from a past he was shedding, that nothing I did or said could possibly matter now. Upstairs, the last folder was being carried out of the mezzanine office, the one with the frosted glass and the discreet plaque. I saw the way the assistant hesitated before handing it off, the brief glance she cast toward the service corridor, the tightening around her mouth. It was subtle, but it was there. A misalignment, a step taken out of order. I felt the shift before anyone else did, the quiet certainty settling in my chest like a held breath finally released. They were celebrating the ending. I was watching the beginning. The first thing that changed was not the volume, but the direction of attention. A server stopped responding to the bride's father mid-sentence and turned toward me instead, asking softly if I would prefer still or sparkling water. It was subtle enough that most people missed it, but not subtle enough that I did. The shift rippled outward in quiet ways. A manager appeared near my table, not theirs. A whispered question was asked into an earpiece. Someone checked a tablet twice instead of once. The bride's father noticed the delay before he noticed the cause. He cleared his throat and gestured sharply, the way men do when they are used to obedience. The manager nodded politely but did not move. Instead, he glanced at me, waiting. I met his eyes and gave a small nod. He smiled and stepped away. Confusion spread in uneven waves. The bride's aunt leaned in and asked what was going on. The cousin frowned, scanning the room. Daniel looked up for the first time in minutes and followed the manager's path, his gaze landing on me and lingering there longer than before. Something tightened behind his eyes, not understanding yet, but recognition of a missing piece. The bride's father stood. "Excuse me," he said loudly, clapping his hands once. "We seem to be having a service issue." The music faltered, conversations thinned, the room leaned toward him, ready to restore the familiar order. "I've been hosting events like this for years," he continued, his voice carrying, "and I can tell you right now, this is not how professionals behave. I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge." There was a pause. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just long enough to be uncomfortable. The manager returned, calm as ever, and gestured toward me. "Of course," he said. "She's right here." Every head turned. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, heavy with recalculation. The bride laughed once, sharp and uncertain. "That's funny," she said. "But no, really." I stood slowly, smoothing my dress, feeling the weight of the room settle into focus. When I spoke, my voice carried without effort. "There's been a misunderstanding," I said, not looking at the bride, but at the manager. The final authorization was processed out of sequence. He nodded. "Yes, we caught it." The bride's father stared at me like a door he had tried to open and failed. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, heat creeping into his tone, "but this is a private event." I turned to him then, meeting his eyes for the first time all night. "It is," I agreed, "and it's being held on my property." Daniel's breath caught audibly. Someone dropped a fork. The bride went very still. I did not rush. Rushing would have cheapened it. I explained just enough to let reality begin its work. The mezzanine office, the contracts, the approval thresholds that had been ignored because everyone assumed the right people were in the room. I did not say everything. I did not need to. The manager filled in the rest with professional clarity, outlining procedural holds and compliance requirements that suddenly mattered very much. The bride's father tried to interrupt. "This is ridiculous. We have agreements." "Yes," I said. "You do. They're being reviewed." "You can't just do that," he snapped. I smiled, not kindly. "I can." Daniel stepped toward me, his face pale. "Maribel," he said, quietly, like saying my name might return us to something simpler. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him and felt something settle that had been unsettled for a long time. "You never asked," I said. The bride found her voice then, brittle and high. "This is some kind of stunt." "It isn't," I replied. "It's a process." The room buzzed now, whispers colliding, phones coming out, people recalculating their proximity to power. The bride's family saw it happening and could not stop it. They had mistaken access for ownership, noise for authority, presence for control. The manager cleared his throat again. "For the moment," he said carefully, "we'll need to pause the event." No one moved. They were all waiting for me. I nodded once. The collapse had not happened yet, but it was close enough to feel. The floor hadn't given way, but the tilt was unmistakable. They were still standing, still breathing, still trying to understand. They just didn't know what was about to hit them. The collapse did not arrive as a scream. It arrived as paperwork. The manager returned with 2 additional staff members and a tablet, his tone courteous but immovable. The music was shut off completely. Glasses were cleared with quiet efficiency. Guests were informed that the event was being suspended pending review of contractual compliance. The word suspended landed like a crack in ice. Conversations erupted all at once, then fell apart just as quickly when the implications became clear. The bride's father demanded names. He demanded explanations. He demanded to know who had authorized this interruption. Each demand met the same response: polite, calm, final. I stood where I was, no longer hidden at the edge of the room, no longer pretending. People turned toward me instinctively now, like iron filings responding to a magnet. Authority does that. It reorders attention without asking permission. The contracts upstairs were not voided dramatically. They were paused, then unraveled line by line under scrutiny that should have been applied hours earlier. Signature authority was challenged. Assumptions were exposed. The room filled with the soft sound of keyboards and the harsher sound of panic. Phones rang. Voices lowered. The bride's family began to realize that what they thought was a celebration had been a negotiation they never had the power to finish. The bride herself stood frozen, clutching her glass like an anchor. Her mother whispered urgently to anyone who would listen, trying to reframe the moment, to suggest misunderstandings, to imply that money could smooth this over. That was when she finally understood the truth. Money had never been the leverage here. Daniel approached me again, slower this time, his confidence stripped bare. "You didn't have to do this like this," he said, as if tone had ever been the issue. I looked at him and felt nothing sharp anymore, just clarity. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "I let things be what they were." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had spent the night watching people decide who I was without defending me once. That silence had been loud enough. The bride's father tried one last time. He stepped into my space and lowered his voice, the way men do when they believe proximity creates influence. "We can resolve this privately," he said. "There's no need to embarrass anyone." I met his gaze steadily. "This is private," I said. "You just forgot you weren't the owner." That was the moment the truth finally reached him, not as anger, as fear. Within minutes, the engagement party ceased to exist. Guests were escorted out under the guise of logistical issues. Vendors were dismissed. Decorations stood half dismantled, frozen in the middle of their intended beauty. The bride's family retreated into frantic clusters, their confidence evaporating as they realized there would be no fixing this tonight, no quick call, no favor to pull. Daniel stood alone. I walked through the room once more, not to gloat, not to savor, but to close something that had been open far too long. I thanked the staff quietly. I confirmed next steps. I signed where my signature mattered and nowhere else. When I left, no one tried to stop me. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it had earlier. Cleaner. I stood for a moment beneath the lights of the building and looked back at the facade they had mistaken for a backdrop. Ownership is not loud. It does not announce itself. It waits until it is needed and then speaks once. People confuse quiet with weakness because they rely on noise to feel important. Entitlement blinds because it assumes permanence where none exists. Patience is misunderstood because it does not perform. But patience paired with preparation always wins, not quickly, not theatrically, completely. I did not destroy them, they revealed themselves. I drove home alone, the city humming around me, already moving on. Somewhere behind me, people were rewriting their version of the night, trying to salvage dignity from assumption. It would not work. Reality had already been documented. There will always be rooms like that one. People who mistake access for power. People who decide who you are without asking. The ending is never loud, but it is always final. And there are more truths like this waiting to be told.